Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to pass on Damien Green's apologies, the Minister of State at the Home Office. He would very much have liked to have been here. You mentioned that Vince Cable couldn't be here. Damien is tied up with announcements on other migration issues this morning, so he asked me to come. I'd also like to just say that we very much value our relationship with Universities UK. Despite the tensions in the policy front, we have very constructive relationships with your officers, Mr. President, Joe, and obviously Nicola, and we very much want to continue that. I'd first just like to talk about numbers of student migrants, just to put a bit of perspective on the debate and in terms of the scale of student migration to the UK. Some stats were published last week by the Home Office and by the Office of National Statistics. If you look at the numbers of student visas that have been issued in recent years, in 2005 it was 176,000. This is Tier 4 and its predecessor routes. That went up to 207,000 in 2008, and then it jumped to 274,000 in 2009. It's come down last year to 236,000 student visas, not counting their dependents. So actually, last year, 2011, was the third highest year on record for student migration to the UK. It's still above the pre-points-based system levels. The ONS, in the stats they published last week, pointed out that study is now the most common reason for migration to the UK. It overtook work, which used to be traditionally the biggest reason for migration to the UK, in 2008 and has continued on an upward trend. In 2001, according to the ONS stats, 80,000 migrated to the UK to study. That was about the same level as the family migration route in 2001. It's now at around 240,000, so there's been a threefold increase in the last 10 years. Clearly, if that trend were to continue, if it tripled again, we'd be at 750,000 around 2020. The Office for National Statistics also said in their publication last week that in the year to June 2011, 170,000 emigrated to the UK from the new, what they call the new Commonwealth, and 75% of them were from the Indian subcontinent. Of them, 2/3 came to study. The ONS noted that was the highest recorded level of immigration from the new Commonwealth. My point is that, and I completely respect what Julie was saying about falling numbers and perceptions, but there has been and there still is a lot of student migration. It's the biggest game in the migration world. It's bigger than work permits, it's bigger than family reunion, it's bigger than asylum, and it's been on a clear upward trend. And given the scale of student migration, you can't be surprised that the immigration authorities and politicians are going to take a close interest in it. And I think no government, whether it's a government which has net migration targets or not, is going to ignore, and whether students are counted as migrants in the migration figures or not. The fact is that student migration is with us and here to stay, and no government's going to ignore that. All governments have a student visa system. The issue is simply, what are the details of that system? And in recent years, the Americans, the Australians, and latterly the French have made quite significant changes in all directions to their student visa systems in response to very rapidly changing numbers and challenges in terms of both security and immigration abuse and all the economic factors which you've talked about, Mr. President. This is a complicated field and one which will continue to preoccupy immigration policymakers, I think, regardless of the underlying government objectives. I just want to look quickly at the reforms that we introduced to the system last year and are continuing to implement up to next month or April. The key point is the government recognises the value of international students, whether it's their economic value, their cultural value, and so on, and also the value of international academic staff. And as you said, Mr. President, we also recognise, that there is, again, as you said, generally speaking, far better compliance with immigration requirements and rules in the higher education sector. So when we consulted on reforms to the student visa system last year, we did listen very carefully, and I do genuinely mean this, to what the Universities UK said to us, and we took on board a lot of those recommendations and representations that were made to us, and we took a strategic decision that we would prioritise the higher education sector within the student visa system. That's reflected in a number of points of detail, which are points of detail, but they are quite important. We did not put an interim limit on the CAS, Certificates of Acceptance of Sponsorship, available to higher education institutions, let alone a permanent limit. We didn't put restrictions on the rights of higher education students to work during their studies. We introduced flexibilities as regards how universities test the English language competence of those students, even though we tightened up those requirements. We listened to what you said about the importance of pathway colleges and foundation degrees. We're not putting additional restrictions on work placements in the higher education sector. We're still allowing dependents to join in certain circumstances, albeit reduced. We're introducing time limits, and we just announced this last week, on the time that students can spend in Tier 4 at the higher level. But we've introduced flexibilities for those attending higher education institutions. We introduced a streamlined process for low-risk students, application process, and we just announced that we will implement a graduate entrepreneur scheme, which we've worked on quite closely with UK. I have to accept that, as you said, Julia, there's a perception issue. I think if you look at the underlying facts of the detail of the reforms that we've made, Britain is open to genuine students. There is nothing stopping universities recruiting additional students, genuine students. The government has tried to counter those perceptions, and I'm talking not just about the Home Office, but about the Foreign Office, UKTI, BIS, the British Council. Clearly, ironically, the more we debate the adverse impacts of the government's immigration reforms, the more adverse publicity will reverberate around the world. That's a fact of life, but we're not trying to perpetuate that situation. As regards the pharmacists that you mentioned, Julia, we have agreed with the Department of Health that we will open a Tier 5 scheme for pharmacists. It's true that we're closing the Tier 1 post-study work scheme, but we've said that graduates who get a graduate level job can stay on in the UK, they can switch their visa from a student visa to a work visa and carry on here working. No student has ever been guaranteed a job on completion of their studies. The Home Office cannot deliver jobs to students. All we can do is give them permission to stay, which is what we've done. I noticed, if you talk to any minister at the moment, they will talk about unemployment, graduate unemployment. That's a fact of life in the UK. It's affecting British graduates. The jobs market is difficult. That I think is adding to the perception as much as the closure of post-study work. We also know that it's important that you can continue to recruit the best international academic staff, and we've taken various measures to try to not impede that or even facilitate it. So when we introduced a limit on the number of economic migrants in Tier 2, we said that if that limit is breached, is reached, we will give priority in allocation under the limit to those in PhD level jobs. Those are designated job occupations. As it happens, the limit has not been reached, so no academic has been stopped coming to the UK because of the limit. The government, and it's now 10:30, so I think I can refer to this, the government today is laying a written ministerial statement announcing its policies on settlement in the UK. One of the features of that is that while we are saying that generally to settle, the migrant must be paid £35,000, we're exempting from that requirement those in these PhD level jobs for researchers and scholars. They will just have to be paid the going rate as now for Tier 2. We open the exceptional talent routes. As Julia said, the take-up of those visas has been low, but we, the Home Office, have delegated decision-making and the criteria for admissions to the competent authorities under that route. It is in the hands of the industry, the sector, to adapt those criteria if there's a perception that they're too tough, or if there's something wrong with the way that route is working. We're quite open to do that. The resident labour market test was mentioned. We specifically asked the Migration Advisory Committee to look at the way that operates. Do higher paid jobs need to be advertised in Job Centre Plus? Should the resident labour market test be valid for 12 months rather than 6 to facilitate the cycle of academic recruitment? We're very open to that. The MAC published their report yesterday. We're also today announcing a new route called permitted paid engagements. This will enable, for example, a visiting lecturer who's coming to do a one-off or a series of short lectures to receive payment without having to go through the points-based system, or people who are coming to participate in exams as examiners, for example, who get payment for that, to do that. We've put it beyond doubt that all that can be done easily within the visa system. On the results of the student reform so far, and I'll finish quickly now, Mr. President, the statistics that were published last week by the Home Office of Student Visas showed that in the final 2 quarters of 2011, the numbers were 148,000. That compares to the 183,000 in the last 2 quarters of 2010. So there has been a fall in student visa numbers. The numbers actually went up in the first 2 quarters of 2011, and then as we introduced our new measures from April, and then we made new ones in July, they started to come down. Our own management information shows that within, which isn't the best, but within those numbers, the numbers coming to universities have held up quite well. There is an exception for India and Pakistan, as Julia mentioned. We need to understand better the reasons for that. China's actually gone up. And the UCAS numbers that were published recently showed that international student numbers had gone up, I think. As regards future policy in this area, clearly the government's going to carry on bearing down on any abuse in the student visa system. UKBA is tightening up its regime on sponsorship compliance. We have a new educational oversight regime through the QAA and the Independent Schools Inspectorate, and we're interviewing more students at the moment as well to see what that tells us. As regards the wider policy, the issue is we don't know or understand or are familiar with the sector's plans for growth. I mentioned at the start of my presentation that the numbers had grown, they'd trebled over the last 10 years. Do you want them to treble over the next 10 years? It's that kind of discussion, I think, that we need to have. Is the proposition that so long as students are genuine, that we should accept any number from any source to do any subject? Damien Green made a speech earlier this month, at the start of this month, where he made clear that he wants an immigration policy which is selective. He wants to select the best, those that will add the most value, not just any value, but the most value. We're very clearly applying that principle in the work routes. The issue is, can it be applied, should it be applied, how would it be applied in the student routes if we want to make any changes in the future? The MAC, in their recent impact report, said it would be interesting to look further at the student sector to understand better how the 5 billion or the 6 billion or the 14 billion, whichever figure we're on, is actually made up? How does that trickle down into the real economy? How does it benefit the resident population? I do think there's scope to have a further objective debate around that. And finally, I think we can talk about numbers and about billions of pounds. For the Home Office, we want to see a relentless focus on the quality of students coming through. For us, that's a sort of watchword for compliant, immigration compliant students. If the quality is right, we think that will lead to sustainable growth, sustainable numbers, and stable policies. I do think the sector, clearly the government's made a lot of changes, and the sector, I can understand, feels a bit battle-weary, as do I, from all the changes that are being made. Those are in response to a very fast-changing sector. I agree that a period of stability would be good. I think that depends on getting the quality right. Somebody told me recently that the US is now taking the cream of students in India. They haven't done that by having an open-door student visa policy. They've had one of the strictest student, if not the strictest student visa policies in the world. Yet it seems to be working well for them, so there might be lessons that we can learn from them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Glyn. Thank you for being so clear.